Hello, I'm Emily. I'm a children's librarian at Medway Libraries. I'm here today to talk to you about reading and well-being. So I've got some statistics, I've got a pile of books which are my personal recommendations based on books which make me feel better when I read them. I've also got a reading of the book that I find most calming as well. Before we get started, you have to apologise, there's lots of DIY going around our neighbourhood, so if you hear tapping, I'm very sorry. Okay, so the benefits of reading. Reading silently for only 6 minutes has been shown to reduce heart rate and ease muscle tension, ranking as more effective than music, going for a walk or sipping a cup of tea. That's from Books on Prescription. Reading for only 30 minutes a day has been shown to add 2 years to your life. That's from Social Science and Medicine in 2016. People who read find it easier to make decisions, plan and prioritise. That's from the University of Liverpool. Adults who read for just 30 minutes a week reported feeling 20% more satisfied with their lives. That's from the University of Liverpool again. Reading before bed can help you sleep. That's from the Mayo Clinic. Reading increases empathy, improves relationships with others, reduces the symptoms of depression and improves well-being throughout life. That's from The Impact of Reading for Pleasure and Empowerment by the Reading Agency 2015. And from the same report, improved social capital for children, young people and general adult population, better parent-child communication and reduction of depression and dementia symptoms amongst adults. Being a regular library user is also associated with a 1.4% increase in the likelihood of reporting good general health, valued at a medical cost saving associated with library engagement at £1.32 per person per year. The aggregate NHS cost savings across the library using English population is £27.5 million per year. That's from the Arts Council in 2015. Reading reduces the risk of dementia by 35%. That's from the New England Journal of Medicine. And it reduces stress levels, anxiety and depression by 68%. That's from Mind Lab International in 2009. So thank you for sticking with me through that. Now, my personal recommendations. So a few years ago I was driving and sort of in one moment I just suddenly couldn't do long journeys anymore. That was very out of character for me. I travelled abroad by myself, and I used to have a job where I was travelling all around the country for different conventions. But just in a moment things changed and I suddenly found it really difficult, and it makes it, even today, a few years later, it still makes me feel very anxious, and I do tend to avoid them where I can. However, if I have to do a long journey, and for me that's anything really over 40 minutes, I tend to put on an audiobook, and it helps calm me down and helps me complete the journey without too much stress. So a lot of these books are really, really good audiobooks as well. We've got a huge selection of audiobooks in our e-library at Medway Libraries. All of these books you can find at Medway Libraries as a physical copy at least. Some of them we have ebooks too, some of them are e-audiobooks. Not forgetting that as of Monday you can click and collect from libraries. Please see our website for more details. So for children, during lockdown, this is probably the best book I've read. It's The Highland Falcon Thief by M.G. Leonard and Sam Sedgman. It's just a fantastic romp. It's a mystery. It's not a murder mystery. It's just a mystery on a train. It's going all around the country. It's like an old vintage type train, and they have to solve a jewellery heist. It's brilliant. It's funny. It's kind. It's just one of the loveliest books I've read the whole time in lockdown, so highly recommend that one. A very, very big book this year has been The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse by Charlie Mackesy. Very sorry to the author there. I think I've gifted 7 or 8 copies of this book now because it is just beautiful. I mean, I think a lot of his drawings do go viral. It's just one of the most beautiful books. highly recommend this one. A really lovely book for just having a mental holiday, and I would recommend this for adults as well, is Swallows and Amazons by Arthur Ransom. If you don't feel like you can travel to the Lake District at the moment, this is just one of the most wonderful books for doing that. It's quite a slow burning book, it's just relaxing and lovely, and I really like the characters in it. For books which it's the world building itself that takes you away, so the story and the characters and the world that it's set in, they're so rich and vividly imagined that you sort of can't concentrate on real life. So pure escapism really, are books like Northern Lights by Philip Pullman, Inkheart by Cornelia Funk, obviously Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and all the Harry Potter books to be honest, by J.K. Rowling, which again the audiobooks by Stephen Fry are just something else, they're amazing. Stormhound by Claire Fayers, that's another one which has just got brilliant world building in it, and the story just sweeps you away. For funny books, Pure Dead Magic by Debbie Gliori. Again, this is a really brilliant audiobook, and it's just so funny. It's a really rich story. It's about a clan up in Scotland who live in a Scottish castle, and there's mythical beasts and all sorts of things go on, lots of shenanigans. The Children of Green Know by Lucy M. Boston is another really beautiful one for a mental holiday. The descriptions of Green Know are just gorgeous. It's just so vividly imagined, it's beautiful. It's a really, really beautiful book to read, and actually I do really recommend reading it around Christmas because it is a Christmas book. For slightly older readers, A Sky Painted Gold was one of the best books I've read, I think in 2018 or 2019. It just blew me away. I read it in one sitting. It's gorgeous, the characters are beautiful, the setting is beautiful, and it just warms your heart, this book, so I'd really recommend it for teen and older. Northchild by Edith Batu, again beautifully imagined book. It's definitely one to read for pure escapism. I know it's quite chunky though. Sabriel by Garth Nix, that's a really good one for pure escapism. It's one of these worlds that just grabs you and doesn't let go. It's the type of book that you will think about for a long time afterwards, so it's really, really good to just lose yourself and forget about the rest of the world. And finally, Spindle's End by Rob Mckinley, which teens could read very easily, even though it's usually shelved under adult fiction. It's just beautifully written. It's a Sleeping Beauty retelling, but it has so much warmth in it, and so it's one of those books which you just can't put down, and it's a really encompassing, enthralling world with amazing characters, so that's another perfect escaping the real world type book. So those are all my recommendations. I'm going to do my reading now. So the book, the go-to for my long car journeys, that makes me feel nice and calm and like I'm able to do it, is 5 on a Treasure Island by Enid Blyton. I'm just getting the page because it's just fallen out. Okay. So for those who haven't read The Famous Five, we've got a bit of The Famous Five here. So this is Timmy the dog. We've got Anne, George. George is a girl, by the way, although she's a real tomboy. We've got Julian and Dick. Okay. So the other children, so Julian, Dick and Anne, are staying with George for the very first time in her lovely house in Cornwall. and she's going to take them out to her island. She actually has her own island with a castle in it for the very first time. So, here we go. "Boat's all ready, George," he said with a grin, "and Tim's ready too." "Thanks," said George, and told the others to get in. They're getting in the boat now. Timothy jumped into, his big tail wagging 19 to the dozen. George pushed the boat off into the surf and then jumped in herself. She took the oars. She rowed splendidly, and the boat shot along over the blue bay. It was a wonderful afternoon, and the children loved the movement of the boat over the water. Timothy stood at the prow and barked whenever a wave reared its head. "He's funny on a wild day," said George, pulling hard. "He barks madly at the big waves and gets so angry if they splash him. He's an awfully good swimmer." "Isn't it nice to have a dog with us?" said Anne, anxious to make up for her mistake. "I do so like him." "Woof," said Timothy in his deep voice, and turned round to lick Anne's ear. "I'm sure he knew what I said," said Anne in delight. "Of course he did," said George. "He understands every single word." "I say, we're getting near your island now," said Julian in excitement. "It's bigger than I thought. And isn't the castle exciting?" They drew near to the island, and the children saw that there were sharp rocks all around it. Unless anyone knew exactly the way to take, no boat or ship could possibly land on the shore of the rocky little island. In the very middle of it, on a low hill, rose the ruined castle. It had been built of big white stones, broken archways, tumble-down towers, ruined walls. That was all that was left of a once beautiful castle, proud and strong. Now the jackdaws nested in it, and the gulls sat on the topmost stones. "It looks awfully mysterious," said Julian. "How I'd love to land there and have a look at the castle. Wouldn't it be fun to spend a night or two there?" George stopped rowing. Her face lit up. "I say," she said in delight. "Do you know, I never thought how lovely that would be. To spend a night on my island, to be there all alone, the four of us, to get our own meals and pretend we really lived there. Wouldn't it be grand?" "Yes, rather," said Dick, looking longingly at the island. Do you suppose your mother would let us?" "I don't know," said George. "She might. You could ask her." "Can't we land there this afternoon?" asked Julian. "No, not if you want to see the wreck," said George. "We've got to get back for tea today, and it will take all the time to row around the other side of Kirin Island and back." "Well, I'd like to see the wreck," said Julian, torn between the island and the wreck. "Here, let me take the oars for a bit, George. You can't do all the rowing." "I can," said George, "but I'd quite enjoy lying back in the boat for a change. Look, I'll take you just by this rocky bit, and then you can take the oars till we find another awkward piece. Honestly, the rocks around this bay are simply dreadful." George and Julian changed places in the boat. Julian rowed well, but not so strongly as George. The boat sped along, rocking smoothly. They went right round the island and saw the castle from the other side. It looked more ruined on the side that faced the sea. "The strong winds come from the open sea," explained George. "There's not really much left of it on this side, except for piles of stones. But there's a good little harbour in a little cove, for those who know how to find it." George took the oars after a while and rowed steadily out beyond the little island. Then she stopped and looked back towards the shore. "How do you know when you're over the wreck?" asked Julian, puzzled. "I should never know." "Well, do you see that church tower on the mainland?" asked George. "And do you see the tip of that hill over there? Well, when you get them exactly in line with one another, between the two towers of the castle and the island, you're pretty well over the wreck. I found that out ages ago." The children saw the tip of the far-off hill and the church tower were practically in line when they looked at them between the two old towers of the island castle. They looked eagerly down into the sea to see if they could spy the wreck. The water was perfectly clear and smooth. There was hardly a wrinkle. Timothy looked down into it too, his head on one side, ears cocked, as if he knew just what he was looking for. The children laughed at him. "We're not exactly over it," said George, looking down too. "The water's so clear today that we should be able to see quite a long way down. Wait, I'll row a bit to the left." "Woof," said Timothy suddenly and wagged his tail. and at the same moment the three children saw something deep down in the water. "It's the wreck," said Julian, almost falling out of the boat in his excitement. "I can see a bit of broken mast. Look, Dick, look." All four children and the dog too gazed down earnestly into the clear water. After a little while they could make out the outlines of a dark hulk out of which the broken mast stood. "It's a bit on one side," said Julian. "Poor old ship. How it must hate lying there, gradually falling to pieces. George, I wish I could dive down and get a closer look at it." "Well, why don't you?" said George. "You've got some swimming trunks on. I've often dived down. I'll come with you if you like, if Dick can keep the boat round about here. There's a current that is trying to take it out to sea. Dick, you'll have to keep working a bit with this oar to keep the boat in one spot." The girl stripped off her jeans and jersey, and Julian did the same. They both had on bathing costumes underneath. George took a beautiful header off the end of the boat, deep down into the water. The others watched her swimming strongly downwards, holding her breath. After a bit she came up, almost bursting for breath. "Well, I almost went down to the wreck," she said. "It's just the same as it always is, seaweedy and covered with limpets and things. I wish I could get right into the ship itself, but I never have enough breath for that. You go down, Julian." So down Julian went, but he was not so good at swimming deep underwater as George was, and he couldn't go down as far. He knew how to open his eyes underwater, so he was able to take a good look at the deck of the wreck. It looked very forlorn and strange. Julian didn't really like it much. It gave him rather a sad sort of feeling. He was glad to go to the top of the water again and take deep breaths of air and feel the warm sunshine on his shoulders. He climbed into the boat. "Most exciting," he said. "Golly, wouldn't I just love to see the wreck properly, go under the deck and into the cabins and look around. And oh, suppose we could really find the boxes of gold." "That's impossible," said George. "I told you proper divers have already gone down and found nothing. What's the time? I say, we'll be late if we don't hurry back now." They did hurry back and managed to be only 5 minutes late for tea. Afterwards they went for a walk on the moors with Timothy at their heels, and by the time that bedtime came, they were all so sleepy that they could hardly keep their eyes open. "Well, good night, George," said Anne, snuggling down into her bed. "We've had a lovely day, thanks to you." "And I've had a lovely day too," said George, rather gruffly. "Thanks to you. I'm glad you all came. We're going to have fun. And won't you love my castle, my little island?" "Oh, yes," said Anne, and fell asleep to a dream of wrecks and castles and islands by the hundred. Oh, when would George take them to her little island? Chapter 5. A Visit to the Island. The children's aunt arranged a picnic for them the next day, and they all went off a little to the cove not far off, where they could bathe and paddle to their hearts' content. They had a wonderful day, but secretly Julian, Dick and Anne wished they could have visited George's island. They would rather have done that than anything. George didn't want to go for the picnic, not because she disliked picnics, but because she couldn't take her dog. Her mother went with the children, and George had passed a whole day without seeing her beloved Timothy. "Bad luck," said Julian, who guessed what she was brooding about. "I can't think why you don't tell your mother about old Tim. I'm sure she wouldn't mind you letting someone else keep him for you. I know my mother wouldn't mind." "I'm not going to tell anybody but you," said George. "I get into awful trouble at home, always. I dare say it's my fault, but I get a bit tired of it. You see, Daddy doesn't make much money with the learned books he writes, and he's always wanting to give Mother and me things he can't afford, so that makes him bad-tempered. He wants to send me away to a good school, but he hasn't got the money. I'm glad. I don't want to go away to school. I like being here. I couldn't bear to part with Timothy." So just to confirm that Timothy is kept in the village by a fisher boy for George, because she's not allowed him anymore, because he was very naughty and used to bark a lot. "You'd like boarding school," said Anne. "We all go. It's fun." "No, it isn't," said George obstinately. "It must be awful to be one of a crowd and to have all the other girls all laughing and yelling around you. I should hate it." "No, you really wouldn't," said Anne. "All that is great fun. It'd be good for you, George, I should think." "If you start telling me what is good for me, I shall hate you," said George, suddenly looking very fierce. Mother and Father are always saying things that are good for me, and they are always things I don't like." All right, said Julian, beginning to laugh. "My goodness, how you do go up in smoke. Honestly, I could believe that you could light a cigarette from the sparks that fly from your eyes." That made George laugh, although she didn't want to. It was really impossible to sulk with good-tempered Julian. They went off to bathe in the sea for the 5th time that day. Soon they were all splashing about happily, and George found time to help Anne to swim. The little girl hadn't got the right stroke, and George felt really proud when she had taught her. "Oh, thanks," said Anne, struggling along. "I'll never be as good as you, but I'd like to be as good as the boys." As they were going home, George spoke to Julian. "Could you say that you want to go and buy a stamp or something?" she said. "Then I could go with you and just have a peep at old Tim. He'll be wondering why I haven't taken him out today." "Right," said Julian. "I don't want stamps, but I could do with an ice. Dick and Anne can go home with your mother and carry the things. I'll just go and tell Aunt Fanny." He ran up to his aunt. "Do you mind if I go and buy some ice creams?" he asked. "We haven't had one all day. I won't be long. Can George go with me?" "I don't expect she'll want to," said his aunt, "but you can ask her." "George, come with me," yelled Julian, setting off to their little village at a great pace. George gave a sudden grin and ran after him. She soon caught him up and smiled gratefully at him. "Thanks," she said. "You go and get the ice creams and I'll have a look at Tim." They parted. Julian bought 4 ice creams and turned to go home. He waited about for George, who came running up after a few minutes. Her face was glowing. "He's all right," she said, "and you can't imagine how pleased he was to see me. He nearly jumped over my head. I say, another ice cream for me. You really are a sport, Julian. I'll have to share something with you quickly. What about going to my island tomorrow?" "Golly," said Julian, his eyes shining. "That would be marvellous. Would you really take us tomorrow? Come on, let's tell the others." The 4 children sat in the garden eating their ices. Julian told them what George had said. They all felt excited. George was pleased. She had always felt quite important before when she had haughtily refused to take any other children to see Kirin Island, but it felt so much nicer somehow to have consented to row her cousins there. "I used to think it was much, much nicer always to do the things on my own," she thought, as she sucked the last bits of her ice. "But it's going to be fun doing things with Julian and the others." The children were sent to wash themselves and to get tidy before supper. They talked eagerly about the visit to the island the next day. Their aunt heard them and smiled. "Well, I really must say I'm pleased that George is going to share something with you," she said. "Would you like to take your dinner there and spend the day? It's hardly worthwhile rowing all the way there and landing unless you're going to spend some hours there." "Oh, Aunt Fanny, it would be marvellous to take our dinner," cried Anne. George looked up. "Are you coming too, Mother?" she asked. "You don't sound at all as if you want me to," said her mother in a hurt tone. "You looked cross yesterday too when you found out I was coming." "No, I shan't come tomorrow, but I'm sure your cousins must think you're an odd girl never to want your mother to go with you." George said nothing. She hardly ever did say a word when she was scolded. The other children said nothing too. They knew perfectly well that it wasn't that George didn't want her mother to go, it was just that she wanted Timothy with her. "Anyway, I couldn't come," went on Aunt Fanny. "I've got some gardening to do. You'll be quite safe with George. She can handle a boat like a man." The 3 children looked eagerly at the weather the next day when they got up. The sun was shining and everything seemed splendid. "Isn't it a marvellous day?" said Anne to George as they dressed. "I'm so looking forward to going to the island." "Well, honestly, I think we really oughtn't to go," said George unexpectedly. "Oh, but why?" cried Anne in dismay. "I think there's going to be a storm or something," said George, looking out to the southwest. "But George, why did you say that?" said Anne impatiently. "Look at the sun, and there's hardly a cloud in the sky." "The wind is wrong," said George, "and can't you see that little white tops of waves out there by my island? That's always a bad sign." "Oh, George, it would be the biggest disappointment of our lives if we don't go today," said Anne, who couldn't bear any disappointment, big or small. "And besides," she added artfully, "if we hang about the house afraid of a storm, we shan't be able to have dear old Tim with us." "Yes, that's true," said George. "All right, we'll go. But mind, if a storm does come, you're not to be a baby. You're to try and enjoy it and not be frightened." "Well, I don't much like storms," began Anne, but stopped when she saw George's scornful look. They went down to breakfast, and George asked her mother if they could take their dinner as planned. Yes, said her mother. You and Anne can help make the sandwiches. You boys can go into the garden and pick some ripe plums to take with you. Julian, you can go down to the village when you've done that and buy some bottles of lemonade or ginger beer, whichever you like. Ginger pop for me, thanks, said Julian, and everyone else said the same. They all felt very happy. It would be marvellous to visit the strange little island. George felt happy because she could be with Tim all day. They set off at last, the food in 2 kit bags. The first thing they did was to fetch Tim. He was tied up in the Fisher boy's backyard. The boy himself was there and grinned at George. Morning, Master George, he said. It seemed to be funny to the other children to hear Georgina called Master George. Tim's been barking his head off for you. I guess he knew you were coming for him today. Of course he did, said George, untying him. He at once went completely mad and tore round and round the children, his tail down and his ears flat. He'd win any race if only he was a greyhound, said Julian admiringly. You could hardly see him for dust. Hey, Tim, him! Come and say good morning. Tim leapt up and licked Julian's left ear as he passed on his whirlwind way. Then he sobered down and ran lovingly by George as they all made their way to the beach. He looked George's bare legs every now and again, and she pulled at his ears gently. They got into the boat, and George pushed off. The Fisher boy waved to them. You won't be very long, will you? He called. There's a storm brewing up. Bad one it'll be, too. I know, shouted George. But maybe we'll get back before it begins. It's pretty far off yet. George rowed all the way to the island. Tim stood at each end of the boat in turn, barking when the waves reared up at him. The children watched the island coming closer and closer. It looked even more exciting than it had the other day. George, where are you going to land? Asked Julian. I simply can't imagine how you know your way in and out of all these awful rocks. I'm afraid every moment we'll bump into them. I'm going to land at the little cove I told you about the other day. There's only one way to it, but I know it very well. It's hidden away on the east side of the island. The girl cleverly worked her boat in and out of the rocks, and suddenly, as it rounded a low wall of sharp rocks, the children saw the cove she had spoken of. It was like a natural little harbour, and was a smooth inlet of water running up to a stretch of sand sheltered between high rocks. The boat slid into the inlet, and at once stopped rocking, for here the water was like glass, and hardly a wrinkle. I say, this is fine, said Julian, his eyes shining with delight. George looked at him, and her eyes shone too, as bright as the sea itself. It was the first time she had ever taken anyone to her precious island, and she was enjoying it. They landed on the smooth yellow sand. We're really on the island, said Anne, as she capered about, Tim joining her and looking as mad as she did. The others laughed. George pulled the boat high up on the sand. Why so far up? Said Julian, helping her. The tide's almost in, isn't it? Surely it won't come as high as this. I told you I thought a storm was coming, said George. If one does, the waves simply tear up this inlet. We don't want to lose our boat, do we? Let's explore the island, let's explore the island, yelled Anne, who was now at the top of the little natural harbour, climbing up the rocks there. Oh, do come on! They all followed her. It was really a most exciting place. Rabbits were everywhere. They scuttled about as the children appeared, but did not go into their holes. Aren't they awfully tame? Said Julian in surprise. Well, nobody ever comes here but me, said George, and I don't frighten them. Tim, if you go after the rabbits, I'll be furious. Tim turned his big, sorrowful eyes onto George. He and George agreed about every single thing, except rabbits. To Tim, rabbits were made for one thing, to chase. He never could understand why George wouldn't let him do this. But he held himself in and walked solemnly by the children, his eyes watching the lolloping rabbits longingly. I believe they would almost eat out of my hand, said Julian. But George shook her head. No, I've tried that with them, she said. They won't. Look at those baby ones. Aren't they lovely? Woof, said Tim, agreeing, and he took a few steps towards them. George made a warning noise in her throat, and Tim walked back, his tail down. There's a castle, said Julian. Shall we explore it now? I want to. Yes, we will, said George. Look, that is where the entrance used to be, through that big broken archway. The children gazed at the enormous old archway, now half broken down. But it was ruined stone steps leading towards the centre of the castle. Oh, sorry, behind it were ruined stone steps leading towards the centre of the castle. It had strong stone walls all about it, with 2 towers, said George. One tower is almost gone, as you can see, but the other is not so bad. The jackdaws build in it every year. They've almost filled it up with their sticks. And as they came near to the better tower of the 2, the jackdaws circled around them with loud cries of "Chuck, chuck, chuck!" Tim leapt into the air as if he thought he could get at them, but they only called mockingly to him. This is the centre of the castle, said George, as they entered through the. This is the centre of the castle, said George, as they entered through a ruined doorway into what looked like a great yard, whose stone floor was now overgrown with grass and other weeds. Here is where the people used to live. You can see where the rooms were. Look, there's one almost whole there. Go through that little door and you'll see it. They trooped through a doorway and found themselves in a dark, stone-walled, stone-roofed room with a space at one end where a fireplace must have been. 2 slit-like windows lit the room. It felt very strange and mysterious. What a pity it's all broken down, said Julian, wandering out again. That room seems to be the only one quite whole. There are some others around here, but all of them seem to either have no roof, or one or other the walls is gone. That room is the only livable one. Was there an upstairs to the castle, George? Of course, said George, but the steps that lead up there are gone. Look, you can see part of an upstairs room there by the jackdaw tower. You can't get up to it, though, because I've tried. I nearly broke my neck trying to get up. The stones crumble away so. Were there any dungeons? Asked Dick. I don't know, said George. I expect so, but nobody could find them now. Everywhere is so overgrown. It was indeed overgrown. Big blackberry bushes grew here and there, and a few gorse bushes forced their way into gaps and corners. The coarse green grass sprang up everywhere, and a pink thrift grew its cushions in holes and crannies. Well, I think it's a perfectly lovely place, said Anne. Perfectly and absolutely lovely. Do you really? Said George, pleased. I'm so glad. Look, we're right on the other side of the island now, facing the sea. Do you see those rocks with the big, peculiar birds sitting there? The children looked. They saw some rocks sticking up with great black shining birds sitting on them in strange positions. They are cormorants, said George. They've caught plenty of fish for their dinner, and they're sitting there digesting it. Hello, they're all flying away. I wonder why. Soon she knew, for from the southwest there suddenly came an ominous rumble. Thunder, said George. That's the storm. It's coming sooner than I thought. So, that's where I'm going to end my reading today. But you can finish the book if you want by borrowing it from Medway libraries. I really highly recommend it. That storm does some very interesting things and throws some very interesting things up from the sea. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed. Bye.